Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good day, whatever time it might be at your end of the world. We'll start with some housekeeping rules before we start the actual webinar. The webinar will be recorded and the recording will be made available in the FSC website. We will organize a questions and answers session at the end of the webinar. And for this, you can type your questions into the chat box, or you can ask them yourself once we get to the end of the presentation. So you have the option of unmuting yourself when you want to ask a question, but we kindly ask you to keep muted at any other times. With that, I think we can start, and I would like to present a very warm welcome to all of you to the webinar on the revised Forest Management Group Standard, a standard that was previously known by the name FSC Standard for group entities in forest management groups. Let's see if the simplified name of the standard entails a more simplified standard altogether. My name is Lauri Ilola, and I've been working with FSC for 6 years now, and I acted as the technical coordinator for this revision process. I have experience over group certification processes on the ground, both from a national and international perspectives, having been first employed by the FSC National Office in Finland, and more recently I've moved over to FSC International. Unfortunately, we don't have my colleague Rosario Galan in the webinar today, but Rosario acted as the coordinator of the revision process and has had vast experience in coordinating similar processes, like the development of the international generic IGIs or the ecosystem services procedure. To support me with the webinar housekeeping, we have Vera Santos, who is the New Approaches Program Manager, and Vera supervised the revision process. The webinar will cover the following main topics. We start with a brief recap of the revision, and then the webinar will cover the main changes that have been applied to the standard, and they should take around 20 minutes. We will also provide you with information on how FSC is supporting the uptake of the standard, and at the end of the presentation we will open the floor for any questions you might have. What we heard often from current forest management group certificate holders prior to the launch of the revision process was that we should not fix something that is not broken. The starting point for the revision was then to evaluate what works well in the existing standard, but we also set out to simplify the language and the structure to allow for a more understandable standard. Additionally, we provided the standard with information boxes and examples to further assist the effective uptake and use of the standard. We've got rid of the typification of the type 1 and type 2 group models, and the revised standard aims to provide much needed flexibility and empowerment for the group entity to decide how to internally organize and manage the group. The FSC global strategy is asking for risk-based approaches to streamline the application of the system. And in the revised standard, we are confident that the proposed solutions are allowing risk to be considered in relation to group certification in a very straightforward way. The revised standard allows for a possibility for the group entity to use a risk-based approach to internal monitoring. There are possibilities for identified risk factors to affect the monitoring intensity, either with the need to increase or decrease the monitoring intensity. And furthermore, the monitoring results will be used to refine the group management system if a need arises, and this requires the group entity to apply an adaptive management approach to running the group. A completely new topic to the standard is the addition of a possibility for the group entities to include forestry contractors into the group. For both the revised internal monitoring methodology and the optional inclusion of forestry contractors, we will have dedicated slides later on in the webinar to dive deeper into the details of those topics. The standard includes a trigger clause for countries with identified high risk of false claims. And in such countries, the group entity needs to maintain up-to-date records of actual harvest and sales volumes per each management unit. High-risk countries will be identified by FSC International on a case-by-case basis, and currently we don't have a list available of any countries where this clause would apply directly. A single group entity can now manage more than one group certificate, and controlled wood has been included into the scope of this standard. This is only a slight change to what was previously allowed for group entities, and controlled wood was not explicitly mentioned in the scope of the standard, even though in reality the group standard had already been used both by forest management and controlled wood enterprises. And in the revised standard, it's now formalized also into the scope. So a group entity can simultaneously manage FM and controlled wood group certificates, but each certificate needs to be exclusively for either FM or controlled wood purposes. The revised standard maintains the possibility for SLIMF management units to conform with the criterion 6.5 across management units. This had already been a possibility in the old standard under the definition of landscape level requirements, although it was not very well understood or used by group entities up to date. The term landscape level requirements has now been replaced with the concept of conformance across management units. And for this topic, we also have a dedicated slide later on illustrating the option in a little more detail. The revised standard requires that the group entity provides rules and guidance on the use of FSC trademarks by the members. This is made to ensure that the members do receive adequate information on how they can use FSC trademarks as part of the group. The initial evaluation of new members can now be conducted as a desk audit for SLIMF and community management units of a group. And in the revised standard, this also takes into account SLIMF management units based on size and intensity, whereas the old standard merely took into consideration the size thresholds for the SLIMF management units. Initial evaluation is also a requirement when there are member movement between groups managed by the same group entity. The revised standard includes some changes to the required members declaration. There needs to be an explicit agreement from the group members to allow for the certification body, FSC and ASI, to fulfill their responsibilities. And the members are requested to provide a declaration that none of the forest management units are already included in another FSC certificate. This declaration does not necessarily need to be in a written form, but if it is, it can also be signed by a representative of the group member if that appointed representative can be verified. The Compilation of member information has been aligned with what is requested in the accreditation standard forest management evaluations from the certification bodies. The collection of information now also includes a notion that the group entity needs to fulfill data protection responsibilities. The requirement of compiling harvest and sales volumes has also been clarified, and it now requires that the group entity collects records of the actual or estimated harvest volumes for the group, as well as actual sales volumes for the entire group. The group entity is required to ensure that all actors, such as members, resource managers, consultants, and contractors, all have sufficient knowledge over their responsibilities and how to fulfill them, which is a slight change and clarification to the previous need for the group entity to provide training and ensure communication of responsibilities. Another clarification and change related to delivery of information is the requirement for the group entity to inform the members over the group rules and applicable forest stewardship standard requirements, as well as to provide explanation on how the group member can conform with the requirements. Any other relevant normative document needs to be made available upon request by the group entity for the group members. The revised standard allows for more flexible options for the group entities to organize the group and to allocate responsibilities to various actors, so long as conformance is demonstrated in each management unit of the group. The concept of resource management units has been clarified, and a specific section has been provided in the standard. So members that enter a resource management unit transfer the overall responsibility of ensuring conformance to a specific resource manager. Members of a resource management unit can conduct some forest management activities in their forest management units, so long as the resource manager oversees and ensures conformance of all of these activities. A clarification also to the allocation of internal nonconformities has been included, where the revised standard explains that the internal nonconformities can be allocated at various levels of the group. So, for example, a nonconformity can be issued at member, contractor, or at group level. And of course, corrective action requests need to be issued and measures taken to address all of the identified nonconformities. And as previously mentioned, we will now cover some of the changes to the standard in a little bit more detail. These are the topics we've understood to be of most interest, or that would require some more information to be shared in order to ensure effective uptake. The internal monitoring allows for the group entity to continue to use a formula-based sampling methodology for defining the sample of management units for the group. And the new formulas include the possibility for the group entity to define in between evaluations which management units have remained inactive and which have undergone some management activities, thus would be labeled as active management units. The new internal monitoring methodology focuses the internal monitoring to management units where active management in the form of site disturbing activities has taken place. The revised standard allows for a possibility for the group entity to use a risk-based approach to internal monitoring, and there are possibilities for identified risk factors to affect the monitoring intensity, either with the need to increase or decrease. And the monitoring results, of course, need to be used to refine the group management system if non-conformities are detected. As mentioned, there are aspects that would result in a higher monitoring intensity need in group certificates, and they are namely a high number of site disturbing activities with group members that would automatically increase the need for internal monitoring. If there are threats posed, for example, to high conservation value forests, that would increase the internal monitoring intensity. And if there are large sized management units included into the group, that would increase the monitoring intensity. Aspects that would in turn result in a lower internal monitoring intensity would be a low number of site disturbing activities with all of the group members, small size or low intensity of forest management, evidence of good performance by the group as a whole, or a possibility to compile information remotely on the management units and over the conformance of management units. These changes only apply to internal monitoring by the group and do not influence the external evaluation conducted by a certification body. The aim of the internal monitoring system is to provide sufficient information to the certification body that all management units of the group are conforming with applicable requirements. The optional inclusion of forestry contractors into the standard follows a process launched after the Vancouver General Assembly, where the New Approaches program has been seeking for appropriate means to streamline and improve the system. And forestry contractors is one topic that has been widely requested by the FSC membership, so that FSC would allow access for forestry contractors into the forest management certification system. And this option has now been added to the revised forest management group's standard. The inclusion of forestry contractors allows the group entity to effectively distribute responsibilities between the various actors in the scope of the certificate. So namely the members, resource managers, contractors, and the group entity itself with its staff. The internal monitoring in groups where contractors are included into the scope of the certificate can now focus more on the operational performance of the contractors rather than only looking for conformance on the forest level. There are requirements for the group entity to ensure that the contractors understand their assigned responsibilities and requirements from the applicable FSC standard and also from the group rules. The assigned responsibilities allow also the group manager to, during its internal monitoring activities, to assign corrective action requests directly to the contractors if there are any non-conformities detected as part of their operations. Essentially, this is allowing the group entity to shift some responsibilities away from the forest owner group members and allocate them to the contractors. Currently, we are developing an interpretation to the accreditation standard forest management evaluations, so that in external evaluations also the role of the forestry contractors in group certificates is understood and fully incorporated into the system. And then on to the last content slide, the concept of conformance across management units is only applicable to the criterion 6.5 of the international generic indicators, and this is related to conservation area networks. This exception has been allowed already in the old standard, but it was not well understood under the landscape level requirements definition. So the revised standard aims to make the concept more understandable and applicable to SLIMF management units in group certificates. The SLIMF management units can amongst themselves share the responsibility of conforming with the criterion requirement, but additionally the larger management units can now support the SLIMF management units in conforming with the requirement, so long as the larger management units first conform with the requirements themselves individually. For example, if a larger management unit sets aside 14% of the total area of the management unit, they can now support the SLIMF management units with a 4% proportionate area of their total management unit. However, if there are any areas that would be needed to be set aside according to the applicable national or regional forest stewardship standard, then these areas will need to be set aside regardless of any additional support from other group members. And with that, we conclude the part of this webinar about the main changes. And we'll now move on to presenting how we plan to support the uptake of the standard. For general support, we are offering the following documents for all stakeholders. A crosswalk has been prepared that illustrates between the old and the revised standard the requirements that have been changed, that have been maintained or removed as part of the revision. Additionally, we will provide a document explaining the main changes of the revised standard in an easily readable format. And we are also preparing a Q&A document where we will compile some common questions and provide some examples on how the revised standard can be used most effectively. And all of these documents will be made available in the FSC website. We are compiling, for example, the questions that you would pose onto the chat box of this webinar and formulating answers to the Q&A document that we cannot cover today or that we deem necessary to be shared also to a wider audience. This week, we are providing our first set of webinars related to the rollout process, and later on, still in March, we are participating in the annual CB meeting that is intended specifically for certification body calibration. We are also participating in any regional meetings to provide support whenever needed. As well as the previously mentioned support from an international perspective, we have planned activities on both regional and national levels. The New Approaches program supports the 2 FSC national offices in Iberia in developing a series of webinars, workshops, and trainings that are developed to fit the needs and contexts of the 2 countries. We are planning activities also with our colleagues in Eastern Africa, as well as participating in an upcoming US group managers meeting to provide further clarity on how the revised standard can be used most effectively. In case you would find it useful that the New Approaches program would work with your national or regional FSC office in developing training and other supportive material, we urge you to reach out to us. Our contact details are on the FSC website, but also at the end of this presentation. And with that, I'll conclude the presentation part of this webinar, and now we welcome any questions you might have for us. And just to summarize, you can also unmute yourself if you want to ask the questions, and Vera will help me with any questions that have been put into the chat box. So please, Vera.
Thank you, Lauri. The chat box has been quite quiet during your presentation. I think people were very focused on what you were saying, but we just received a question that is asking about if an auditor issues a car and the group member blames the contractor blames the group member, how will the dispute be resolved? And who will be covering the cost of responding the car?
That's a good question. So now that we've included contractors into the group certificate, of course, they need to be assigned with responsibilities on what they have to ensure in terms of conformance. The group rules need to be adapted in a way that these responsibilities are clear, and the division of responsibilities should act as the backbone for the group entity to decide and allocate the non-conformities and issue the corrective action requests for both the members and to the contractors.
We just received a second question now, this time regarding the conformance with the 6.5 at a SLIMF level. And it's asking if it can be achieved through support for conservation actions external to the members.
Yes, the conformance with 6.5 for SLIMF management units can be achieved through support from other group members. There was an interpretation also illustrating the possibility for forest management units that are less than 50 hectares, and they could conform with the requirements of the criterion 6.5 also outside of the scope of the certificate. But this interpretation has now been made null and void after the revision, as we provided the possibility of the larger management units having the possibility of supporting the SLIMF management units in achieving conformance.
Thank you, Lauri. The next question is more procedural, and it's about the effective date and transition period for the revised version of the standard. So
the effective date for this standard is the 16th of March, so in less than 2 weeks. And the transition time is the generic time in FSC, which is 12 months.
We have now another question regarding contractors, and it's about if they can trade material produced in the forest management unit under the scope of the certificate.
Yes, they can. So the contractors can now utilize the chain of custody system of the group certificate, and they don't necessarily need to have their own individual chain of custody certificate. This is being made to ensure that there is streamlining within the revised standard, and this also allows the possibility for the group entity to better control the output of the group. So any forest products that are sold with an FSC claim would now be put to the group certificate itself and not spread across multiple chain of custody certificates with the contractors.
In this case, the question had additional follow-up questions. So one, you partially had the answer, if they need to meet the standards for the 30-004. But there's also a question if they can trade material outside the forest management unit.
So if they would be harvesting materials that is from a management unit that is not covered in the scope of this group certificate, that option is not available for the contractor. So for example, if they would be offering their services and would be included into the scope of multiple group certificates, then they would have to deal with the chain of custody system of each of those group certificates individually. So if they harvest from multiple groups, then they would have to use multiple chain of custody systems to cover for the sales of any FSC certified forest products.
The next question is now regarding false claims and is specifying that there are two possibilities regarding a false claim. Total harvesting volumes exceed the maximum / actual harvestable volumes. Total sales volumes exceed the harvesting volumes. The question is specifically about how FSC will control these false claims.
That's a very good question, and of course this standard can only provide solutions to the internal setup of group certificates, and then there is a parallel or ongoing revision of the FM evaluation standard. So the accreditation or auditing standard for forest management enterprises, and that will cover the other side of the coin. In terms of this standard, we've applied a trigger clause which would require that the group entity compiles actual harvest and actual sales volumes for both the group, but also verify that those volumes both match on a management unit level. So in some countries, timber is being traded first in estimates prior to harvesting, and then contractors assume the ownership of that timber and then sell it to a mill. And the actual harvest volume is actually only quantified at the mill level, which is outside of the scope of an FM group certificate. And that has made it tricky for FSC to keep track of the disparity between the harvested and the sold volumes. But in cases where FSC International has deemed a country being high risk of having false claims, then the group entity would have to request that information from the contractors or any other party that would be possessing the actual information of the harvest volumes. Hopefully that answered the question.
If not, kindly raise your hand and we can unmute the person asking the question.
Just a really quick follow-up to that. We will definitely be providing some additional clarity in the form of the Q&A document that will be circulated a little later on that specific note on the false claims possibilities and how to apply the trigger clause included into the standard.
That's very useful, Lauri, thank you. The follow-up question is about a clarification on the set-aside areas again. And you have mentioned about the possibility of exempting from the requirements the other members that has over 10% of the set-aside area. I'm not sure I understand it. And how about if the total set-aside area remain less than 10%?
A good question. And just to clarify, on the group level, you would at all times need to have conformance with the criterion 6.5 requirement. So if, for example, on a national level, the national standard requires that all certified operations must have a minimum of 10% of set-aside areas proportionate to the total management unit area, then you would have to at all times ensure that you don't go below the 10% proportionate area. So the possibility allows the group entity to allocate the responsibility of conforming with the criterion 6.5 across SLIMF management units, and also that the larger, so non-SLIMF management units can support this conformance on a group level, but they would have to conform also individually before supporting any other group members in the conformance. This also applies or allows rather on the group level that a little bit more meaningful and larger conservation area networks can be achieved if there's a lot of smaller group members joining the system. We would not require all of the small management units to have their own individual set-aside areas. Hope that answered the question.
Thank you, Lauri. The two next questions are again more procedural. So there's a first one regarding how to prepare groups for the changed standard when the transition period starts immediately. And the other is regarding the use of the old standard during the transition period. So
the transition period means that during that period of 12 months, the group certificate holders would have to use the revised standard during that transition time. So for example, if you would experience an external evaluation, let's say in April, you could still utilize the old group certification standard, but during the 12-month period, you would have to transition and have an external evaluation based on the revised FM groups standard.
The next one goes again to 6.5 criterion.
Mhm.
And is asking if it needs to be shared over the SLIMF group as a whole, or can be shared within the subgroups or at the resource management unit level.
That's a very good question, and you can, within the group rules, you can define how you conform with the requirement if you want to deviate from the generic requirement that all management units need to conform with the full set of requirements from the applicable forest stewardship standard. So if you want, you can do it on a group level for all of the SLIMF, or you can set specific subgroups within the group certificate, and a resource management unit would constitute as a subgroup that you could use in ensuring that there is conformance with all of the management units. Hope that answered the question.
Thank you, Lauri. And we have now a question regarding if the group members can be with different products. So for example, some with timber, some with non-timber forest products, and some with ecosystem services. Yes,
so the group standard applies to all types of forest management certification, and you can, within the same group, have production of timber products, non-timber forest products, and of course the ecosystem services claims. So that is a possibility.
There's a request, and I think you can then extend this to other participants. If the participant asking the question regarding the false claims, he would like to follow up with an email for further discussion and I imagine clarification, we would welcome this very much from all of you as soon as possible.
Yes, exactly. So please feel free to contact us if you want any clarification or if you have any other requests.
And the last question so far on the chat, still on the 6.5, we do know this is a very important topic. Can conformance with the 6.5 at the SLIMF level be achieved through support for conservation actions external to the members? In the past, this was permitted where all group members are SLIMF small growers.
Yes, it was allowed through an interpretation that provided this possibility for management units that are less than 50 hectares, but anything going beyond 50 hectares would have to conform with the requirement through the group certificate amongst the members. And as I previously stated, this interpretation has now been or will be retracted. But if there is a compelling need to continue with that, of course, there is a possibility to request for a similar type of interpretation, and then it would be evaluated against the revised standard, and that way another similar type of possibility could be provided. But with the revised standard, as we are allowing for more flexibility in relation to the criterion 6.5, this interpretation has been retracted.
And I think we don't have any more questions so far. We still have 20 minutes to go.
Yes. If anybody wants to ask, you can simply unmute yourself, or you can continue to use the chat box if you prefer.
Don't be shy. Lauri is here, very happy to clarify any doubts that you have.
Okay, I'm simply going to reinstate our request to you. So if you have a need that you would want us to correct, so if you want your national FSC office or your regional FSC office to work with us on providing any type of materials that would fit or would cover some of your national context, national needs, please do contact us, and we can see if we can support you and your national/regional office.
Sorry, I was having trouble to unmute myself. There's a follow-up comment regarding the false claims. Maybe you can share some of the discussion that were held during the revision and how the proposal has been captured like it was, if it helps.
Yes, of course. The discussions we had included, of course, FSC International, some members and FSC national offices on how to deal with the problem of possibility of having false claims with FM group certification. And the trigger clause we have included is based on identification of risk by FSC International, and then would apply on a country level to all of the group certificates. And this is a means for us to request that internally all of the group certificates would follow a certain procedure in risk situations. And this, of course, will also have an impact on the revision of any other related normative documents, so namely the revision of the forest management evaluations standard.
Thank you, Lauri. We got another 2 questions. One is regarding the possibility of disputes between members and contractors. And the question is about if should FSC advise groups to take out special insurance against legal actions?
In this case and in any other case in FSC, we would advise everybody to, in the case of disputes, to follow the dispute procedure. And the inclusion of contractors into group certificates is optional. It is not mandatory under the revised standard. So the group entity can decide whether or not it is beneficial for them to include also the contractors on the ground to the certificate if they want to divide responsibilities effectively between the forest owners and the contractors and the group entity itself. But it is by no means something that they would have to do. And this also applies to contractors, that they can choose to either join or not to join a group certificate. So I'm not sure if I answered the question properly, but at this stage we are not foreseeing any special needs to any certificate holders to get insured. But of course we can look into this as well.
The next question, which is a little bit long, what happens if an owner manager certifies an area, harvests it, sells forest material as certified, and then loses certification, either by leaving the group after 5 years or being expelled from the group, thus not fulfilling the long-term management commitment with the forest management? Sorry, I need to pull it back. The long-term management commitment of the forest area exploited in accordance with FSC principles and criteria. Will the product supply be disqualified, treated as FSC non-conforming product? Will the buyer and certifier be informed of it?
A good question. FSC provides a voluntary certification system for any forest owner around the world. So people can join voluntarily and they can also leave at their discretion. Of course, the group rules, so the contract between the forest owner members of a group and the group entity play a big role in setting the frame for the long-term commitment of any group member. But if they harvest and sell certified forest material, and at the stage that it is sold, everything is fine and the forest owner is certified, then even if the group member leaves right after the point of sales, the material is still being considered as certified. But of course, this is something that we will take note of, and if need be, we can follow up with this request for information. But this would be my answer at this stage. Vera, you're muted if you try to speak.
Sorry, I did click on the button, but it ignored me. There's another question on active-inactive distinction, applying when the group has multiple material products and ecosystem services, how this would function.
So the division of active and inactive management units is based on site disturbing activity. So you would have to define what is site disturbing, and that would of course be derived from what is explained in the national standard. So site disturbing activities would be, for example, if you conduct harvesting of timber, if you have if you are building new forest roads, or any type of other site disturbing activity that would deem your management unit as active. Some of the, for example, non-timber forest product harvests don't actually constitute as site disturbing as such. And ecosystem services procedure, you don't actually need to, in many cases, disturb the sites as such. You simply verify and validate the positive impact on any ecosystem service that is included into the scope of the certificate. So the division between active and inactive is made so that the internal monitoring activities would be focused on the management units where the greatest risk of non-conformities would be, as based on the definition for site disturbing activities.
Thank you, Lauri. There's a comment still related with the false claims issued. Another issue is transaction still happens during suspension period. Not sure.
Well, of course, that is against FSC rules, that you cannot actually trade in FSC certified materials if the certificate is suspended. And this would, of course, require FSC to take action against such certificate holders.
Thank you. The next question goes for the contractor. So if the contractor can use a group's chain of custody, how they will be reflected in the group certificate / FSC database? Will they be in the list as other group members? Will they have several certificates in the case of contractor that belongs to several groups?
A good question. And at the moment, as the reporting requirements are not really attached to this specific standard, we will have to work around that issue, that how the contractors will be reflected in the FSC certificate database. But that is something that will surely be reflected once we get the revision of the reporting requirements underway. And in relation to the question about several certificates, the contractors themselves would not possess the certificates. They would be merely members and included into the scope of existing forest management chain of custody certificates.
The next question is related with the previous one. So FSC, maybe it's not a question, it's more a suggestion. FSC or the certification body should show a suspension period explicitly from X date to X date in the FSC website, so the buyers can know and stop buying from a suspended FSC certificate holder during that period. It's more of a
yes, that is noted. And I think Hung Luong was the one suggesting that we would be in contact via email, and we can definitely do that after the webinar if there's a specific case that you want to discuss.
And there's another support from another participant that I'm not sure if I will dare to pronounce the name, Unton Carnanto. He would probably, we can involve them both in answering that question, Lauri.
Yes, of course.
The next question is about training materials and what will be the new training materials provided to implement this version 2. Will draft contracts be provided for groups involving new contractors?
The training materials from FSC International will be the ones that I discussed. So the crosswalk between the old and the revised standard is one. And then we will be providing the Q&A document, which describes the main changes and provides a little bit of additional information. And then the Q&A document that will dive into providing some more examples, hopefully more of the nature of live examples of how you can set up group certificates, for example, including contractors into the scope of the certificate. So we try to address any doubts or problems that the certificate holders might have in relation to the uptake of the standard. And we are providing national and regional training possibilities. So if there's anybody that would like to explore the possibilities of us supporting them in making the most out of the revised standard, we are of course happy to assist.
And one last comment on the chat box is about the issue being raised before. It's also very useful for the certification bodies.
Yes, exactly, and that is noted. And yes, the risk-based clause, the trigger clause that we have included into the standard would definitely probably help in cases described and discussed during this session.
Lauri, we will be providing the chat content to all participants, or this will be used internally for capture the questions?
We will use the chat box to compile the Q&A document, but we will not share the chat box along with the names with anybody outside of this webinar. So it will not be distributed on the website, but rather the content of the discussion and the questions.
So if there's a topic that you have found very important for you and for your setting, your role as a certificate holder or a buyer or a certification body or a consultant or a group manager, does write to us because then we can go deeper into that topic and complement any dimension of the topic itself in the document Lauri has been mentioning, the question and answer document.
Yes.
And I'm afraid I have nothing else on the chat box.
Okay, let's give a minute or two, and if there's no questions, then we will conclude the webinar. Nothing?
No.
Okay.
Sorry, Lauri, did we address the second part of the question, or I can't remember if I can't recall if I read it or not, if the draft contracts will be provided for groups involving new contractors? I read it, right?
Yes, you read it. I didn't respond actually, so that's a good point. We will not be providing at this stage, at least, any draft contracts to be used, but in the past, FSC has compiled, for example, this manual for new group certificate holders with an extensive list of templates that could be used. This is something that we can, of course, do in the future as well if it's deemed necessary. So if you would like to see a host of templates that you could use for administrating and managing your group certificate, you are more than welcome to reach out to us. But if there's no other questions, I thank all of the participants. I hope this webinar provided some additional clarity, and we will be uploading the mentioned documents onto the FSC International website. There is a specific process webpage for the revision of the forest management group's standard. So we will reach out to you by email, but you can also have an eye out for this process website. There's already the crosswalk between the old and the revised standard that you can download and use when you are preparing to transition from the old to the revised standard. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you.